Hey there, it's Rebecca from Bryan House Quilts. In this YouTube video, I'm going to show you how I cut and save my selvages from my fabric stash so that I can use them later in a super scrappy project. Whenever I get new fabric, I usually make it a point to cut the selvages off the fabric before I actually use the fabric. And then I save the selvages in a pretty jar so that I can use the selvages later to make this pretty selvage fabric, and then I'll use it in a project. So I'm going to show you how I like to cut my selvages off and save them. As far as materials, all you need to save your selvages from your fabric stash is your fabric stash, your cutting board, acrylic ruler, and rotary cutter, and a pretty jar to store your selvages. Before I show you how I like to cut my selvages, I want to tell you why I like to cut my selvages the way I do. So in some selvage projects, I've seen selvages cut and they're really thin, so thin that when you go to sew them together, there's not a lot of the original print left. So here's an example of a selvage that's been cut where there's not a lot of that pretty strawberry print left. I like to cut my selvages nice and fat so that when I sew them into my selvage fabric, you can see a healthy chunk of this nice pretty fabric, right? So that's how I like to cut mine. I like to cut mine nice and fat, and let me show you how I do that. So it's really simple. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna unfold my new fabric, and this fabric is so cute. I love these black and white bears. This is from Sarah Watts Black and White for cotton and steel, and it's just so pretty, and I love this selvage, and this is one of the reasons I love saving selvages, is because the selvage is just so gorgeous. How could one just throw that in the trash? We've got to use it, right? Okay, so what I've done is I've lined up the fold of the fabric, and this is a 1/2 yard. I've lined up the fold here, and it's on the 5-inch line here. And what I like to do is I usually like to give myself at least 20 inches here. So I'm measuring from 5 to 25, and that is 20 inches. And the reason I do 20 inches is because most quilt patterns call for at least 40 inches wide of fabric. So I really want to stick with that. I don't want to cut so much selvage off that I've ruined the actual piece of fabric for a quilt pattern. So in reality, I usually try to do 20.5 inches. So I've got from 5 to 25 right here. So this is 5 to 25, and I've given myself a 1/2 inch just for a little wiggle room. And you can see I've got a nice chunk of selvage to play with. So once I've got it lined up, I'm just going to use my acrylic ruler and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to cut. And I've got this pretty selvage that I get to save for a later project. Isn't that fun? Here's another example. So I'm lining up the fold of the fabric, and again, this is a 1/2 yard. I usually buy my fabric purchases in a 1/2 yard or a fat quarter. Okay, so I've lined up the fold with the 3-inch line now. And now I'm going to measure 20 inches up to 23 inches right here. So I've got 20 inches here. So 3 to 23. And I'm going to give myself at least a 1/2 inch here, just so I have 41 inches of actual fabric to use in a future quilt pattern. And for this selvage, I think I could go skinnier and still have a lot of the pattern left, but the pattern's so gorgeous, and I could really see how it would work well in a pretty selvage fabric later. So I'm going to go ahead and do the 20.5 measurement. So just to double check, 3 inches here, 23 inches here, plus that extra 1/2 inch for wiggle room. Okay, now I'm going to cut. And voila, a pretty selvage to play with later. All right, so I've shown you 2 examples of how I cut selvages from a 1/2 yard of fabric. I also do this for my fat quarters, and I'll show you how I do that for fat quarters. So fat quarters are a little bit hit and miss because sometimes you'll get the selvage with the writing on it and sometimes you'll get the selvage with just the print on it. So it really depends. I don't think it matters either way because the more variety you have, the more variety in your selvage fabric that you have, the prettier it's going to be. So I say a good mix is great. So let me see if I can find a good example in my fat quarters. This is an old fat quarter bundle I have by Denise Schmidt. It's one of my favorite lines she's done. The line is called Chickapee. And it's got these really lush, rich fall colors, and it's a favorite for a lot of people, myself included. Okay, so what I've done with this fat quarter is I've lined up one of the ends here with a line on my cutting mat here, and I've lined it up with a 3-inch line here. And then I'm going to put my ruler at 23. Fat quarters can be a little tricky because they're folded up so tightly that you can have a lot of these folds. I'm okay with the folds, but if you're having trouble getting an accurate measurement, you might want to give your fat quarter a press. I'm not going to because I want to wrap it up and put it back in my pretty stack so I can display it and still have a pretty fat quarter stack to look at. But if you have trouble with those folds, you might want to iron your fabric. All right, so what I've done here, I've lined it up with a 3-inch line, and I've got my ruler with a 23-inch line. Before you cut your fat quarter, I want to tell you that a lot of quilt pattern designers write their quilt patterns, and when they write their quilt patterns, they call for fat quarters that are 18 inches by 20 inches. So if you go to cut your fat quarters, if you cut the selvage off your fat quarter, you want to make sure that you leave yourself a workable 18 inches by 20 inches fat quarter. So before you cut it, make sure that you still have that fabric. So that's what I'm going to do now. I want to make sure that I've got 20 inches by 18 inches. And I know here that I've got my 20 inches. So I've got 3 and 23 is 20. And it shouldn't matter this way because I'm not cutting this way. But just to show you, you can see that this fat quarter comes out just about 18, just shy of 18.5 inches. So I'm good. So I've got 3 inches, 23 inches. I'm going to give myself a little bit more wiggle room and cut at the 20.5 inch mark here. And you can still see I've got a nice bit of selvage material here to work with. Okay, and I've got one pretty selvage from a fat quarter to play with for my selvage fabric later. All right, I'm going to show you one more fat quarter and then we'll call it a day for this tutorial. Let's do the black and white here. All right, so I'm unfolding my fat quarter. And you can see this selvage doesn't have any of the pretty writing on it, none of the text. That part of the selvage is going to be on what used to be attached to this fat quarter on the other side of the fabric, which again is no big deal because we want a lot of variety in our scraps from our selvages to make that future scrappy selvage project really pretty. That's a lot of S's. Future scrappy selvage project. No, it's only 2 S's. I guess it's just too many S's for me. All right, so I've lined up one of the sides of the fat quarter with the 4-inch line on my cutting mat. I'm going to bring my ruler to 20 inches down, so I'm at 24 inches here. And again, before you cut your selvage off your fat quarter, you want to make sure that you're leaving yourself at least 18 inches by 20 inches so that you can use your fabric in future quilt projects. So I've got 18 inches here, so 18 inches, yes. And then I've got my 20 inches here, so I'm good. I'm just gonna move the ruler over just a ½ inch to give myself a little bit more workable fabric. I've got plenty of selvage, so that's where I feel comfortable. And now that I've got it lined up, I'm gonna cut. All right, there's another pretty selvage to add to our selvage jar. And pretty simple, that's it. And now that I've got some more selvages cut, I'm just gonna put them in my jar and I'm gonna save them for a future scrappy project. All right, tune in to my next YouTube video where I will be showing you exactly how I use my selvages to create selvage fabric. All right, that's all for me today. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.